the feeling I'm talking about. Not anger, not a fight. Just a specific kind of empty that sets in after you've spent time with a particular person. The conversation moved through the right motions. They seemed warm. They asked about you, at least in the opening minutes. But somewhere in the middle, you noticed something shift, and by the end you were mostly listening to them. Again. And the hollow that followed wasn't confusion. It was recognition. You've been here before. Something was taken that you never consciously offered. I spent a long time not having a name for that. Eventually, Jung gave me one. He spent decades mapping what he called the problem of psychic self-enclosure, the mind so entirely organized around its own image of itself that it cannot make genuine contact with what's outside it. Not because of malice, because of architecture. Here's how he described the structure. Everyone builds what he called the persona, a presentation layer, a way of translating the interior self into something navigable for the social world. Normal, necessary, not pathological. What he observed in what he called the egocentric personality, what we'd now call the narcissistic configuration, was something specific. Not an inflated persona over a healthy self. A persona fused so completely to an idealized self-image that the actual self beneath it has nowhere to surface. And the gap between the ideal being performed and the reality underneath, that gap requires constant maintenance. Defensive energy running continuously below the surface. The psyche working all the time to keep the distance between who they believe themselves to be and who they know, somewhere much deeper, they actually are, from collapsing. In Ion, one of his later works, Jung described what happens when a person cannot integrate their shadow, the accumulated material of unacknowledged weakness, genuine failure, the moments they were wrong and didn't want to be. The shadow doesn't disappear when it goes unacknowledged. It gets projected outward. And what he found, again and again, was this. Underneath the grandiosity is a wound of inadequacy buried so deeply the person cannot approach it. The confidence is the covering. The entitlement is the covering. This is why you feel empty after those conversations. Making contact with your genuine experience would require, structurally, the capacity to approach their own. They can't do one without risking the other. So what looks like indifference to your interior life is really self-protection. The psyche closing a door it cannot afford to open. Researchers at Oregon State University spent time studying a specific thing: how narcissists process their own mistakes. What they found was precise. Most people, after getting something wrong, engage in what the researchers called should-counterfactual thinking. They replay the situation. What should I have done differently? Where did I miss something? That kind of reflection is uncomfortable, and it's exactly how the psyche updates. Narcissists, they found, essentially skip this. When they predicted an outcome correctly, they remembered it as more foreseeable than it was. I knew it all along. When they predicted incorrectly, they remembered the outcome as less foreseeable. Nobody could have seen that coming. The hindsight adjusted in both directions, always protecting the image. Not as a deliberate strategy, as an architecture so deeply embedded it runs below the level of conscious choice. That's the foundation for the question. It's simple. You just ask, what's something you've been wrong about lately? Then you listen, not for a confession, for the relationship between the person and their own fallibility. 3 patterns reveal the structure underneath. The first is deflection. There's an acknowledgement in form and an escape in content. The mistake happened, but it belongs to the situation, the timing, the person who gave them bad information. Something external carries what might otherwise land on them. The second is the collapse into triumph. I was wrong about this. Brief pause, seemingly real. But that actually led me to something I wouldn't have found otherwise. The error becomes a stepping stone before the sentence finishes. The discomfort resolves before it was ever genuinely held. The third, and the most sophisticated, is the performance of self-awareness. I'm a very flawed person. I make mistakes constantly. The admission is large and general and costs nothing specific. Watch carefully. No names, no dates, no moment that still carries discomfort. And often a trace of pride because the self-awareness itself has become the credential. I'm honest enough to admit my failures without actually sitting in one. What you almost never encounter is a specific acknowledgement with a specific cost, where the discomfort hasn't fully resolved. A mistake that's still being lived, not yet converted into a lesson. Something where they're still in the middle of being wrong about it. That quality, the unresolved, the still uncomfortable, that's what genuine accountability sounds like. Jung would call it shadow integration, the capacity to hold difficult material without immediately transforming it into something that restores the ego. In my last year at the hospice, I spent several weeks with a family while their mother was dying. Her adult son was there most days. He was present, attentive. He asked about her care, took notes, wanted to understand the process. But I noticed a pattern in how our conversations moved. They would start in her direction, and then, without quite announcing the turn, they would migrate to him. What this had cost him, what he'd put aside, the weight he was carrying specifically, not said with obvious self-pity. He'd often interrupt himself. I know it's not about me, and then continue with more of him. One afternoon, I asked him a simple question. What do you think your mother is afraid of right now? He went quiet. Then he started to answer, and within about 40 seconds, the answer had become about what he was afraid of, what the loss would mean for his life, his future, the shape of things without her. He hadn't moved into her experience at all, not even briefly. I don't think he knew that. That's the part Jung would have recognized. The absence of that capacity doesn't feel like an absence from the inside. It feels like caring. It just has a different center. Here's what I want to leave you with. This isn't a diagnostic tool to use on enemies. The word narcissist has been spread so broadly in recent years that it sometimes loses its precision. What you're actually trying to understand is simpler. Can this person make contact with something real in you? Not produce the correct sounding responses, actually reach it. The question, what have you been wrong about, creates one moment that requires genuine contact with the self. The ability to sit with your own fallibility, even briefly, is the same architecture that makes real empathy possible. They use the same structure. You can't do one without access to the other. What happens in that moment is what you came for. Not a test. A window. And once you've seen through it, you don't forget what you saw.